They declared her dead while her heart was still beating. No grave, no vigil, no tearful goodbye from the people who were supposed to love her. Just Elder Dagmar's smooth, practiced voice drifting through the crack in the stone above her head, announcing to the gathered pack, and to the Alpha King who had crossed 3 territories to find his true mate, that Astrid of the Ironville pack had been taken by the border wraiths at the crossing and was gone from this world. She was not gone. She was 10 feet below the ceremony floor, sealed inside the hollow carved into the border wall itself, listening to her own name being buried. What Ragnvald had not counted on, what none of them could have known, because only Astrid's late father had ever taught her this particular truth, was that a mate bond could not be stolen, could not be redirected like river water or passed off like a borrowed dress. It always found. And somewhere above her, in the middle of the most sacred werewolf ceremony in the known territories, the Alpha King had just gone very, very still. If you're listening to this right now, take a moment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read through so many of your comments, and it genuinely amazes me how these stories connect people from completely different parts of the world at the exact same moment. Back to the story. The cold came first. Not the ordinary cold of a winter evening, not the chill of stone against bare skin. This was something that lived deeper than temperature. The cold of being erased, of having your name spoken in past tense while your lungs still pulled air and your wolf still paced inside your chest, furious and frightened and absolutely, stubbornly alive. Astrid had been inside the hollow for 3 hours. She knew this because she had counted her own heartbeats for a while, then stopped when the number became too heavy to carry. She knew it because the thin sliver of sky she could see through the hairline crack above her had shifted from amber to deep violet to the flat, starless dark of a proper ceremony night. She knew it because the warmth in her chest, a warmth she hadn't understood until 2 hours ago, had grown from a murmur into something that felt like a living thing pressing against her ribs from the inside, testing the walls, searching for a way through. The hollow itself was ancient, ancestor-carved, her father had told her once, pressing her small hand flat against the stone marks when she was 6 years old and barely tall enough to reach them. Territorial symbols from a time when the Ironville pack had needed to mark the border in blood and granite because words alone weren't enough. The chamber was just wide enough for 2 careful paces in either direction and barely tall enough for Astrid to stand without bending her neck. There was no light except what slipped through the crack in the ceiling, and that was very little. But she could hear the ceremony above her. That was perhaps the cruelest part. The sounds drifted down through the stone with muffled underwater clarity, the deep percussion of the border drums, the shuffle of many feet finding their formal positions, the low musical call of the territorial horn that marked the opening of the ritual. The border ceremony had been held at this wall every generation since the old pact was made. Every eligible wolf of mating age stood at the boundary while the officiating elder called the names of those the moon goddess had marked. It was sacred, it was beautiful. And Astrid was missing it from a sealed chamber underground. She pressed her back against the wall and let herself slide down until she was sitting in the dust, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around herself the way she had learned to do during the years when no one else was going to hold her together. Then Elder Dagmar's voice came through the crack. She had known it was coming. Ragnvald had told her this morning, in that calm and pleasant way of his, the voice he used when he had already won and wanted you to understand it without making a scene. He had said, "The pack will need an explanation for your absence. We will give them one that doesn't cause questions." She had understood what that meant even before he said the next part. But understanding a thing and hearing it spoken aloud were 2 very different experiences. "It is with great sorrow," Dagmar said above her, his voice carrying the formal weight of a man who had performed these ceremonies for 40 years, "that I must share a loss with you tonight. Astrid of Ironville, daughter of our beloved Beta Aldrich, has been taken at the border crossing. The wraiths came without warning. She is gone from this world, and we carry her memory forward in the old way, with silence and with honor." The silence above was total, the kind that happened when a crowd of people stopped breathing all at once. Astrid sat in the dark and waited to feel something. Rage, perhaps, or grief, the desperate, screaming need to pound on the stone until someone heard her. What she felt instead was a strange, hollow calm. The calm of someone who has been bracing for impact for so long that when it finally arrives, there is almost a relief in it. She had cried herself raw in the first hour, screamed until her voice gave out in the second. By the third, there was nothing left but the cold and the dust and the quiet and the golden warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with Ragnvald or Sigrid or Freydis or any of them. That warmth was the only thing that mattered now. It had arrived the way the dawn did, gradually and then all at once. 2 hours ago, she had been sitting in complete stillness when something shifted inside her sternum, a warmth with no source. Her wolf had lifted her head for the first time in hours, ears forward, every sense angled upward and slightly north, not toward the sound of the ceremony, toward something beneath the sound, something approaching. Astrid had taken a long time to understand what she was feeling. She had never experienced the mate bond before, almost no wolf did, until the moment of meeting, when it clicked into place like a key finding its lock. But her father had described it to her once, carefully and specifically, in the way Aldrich always described things he thought she might need later. He had said it felt like a thread of warmth in the center of your chest that you hadn't known was missing until it was suddenly, undeniably, there. She pressed her palm flat against the stone wall and felt the warmth pulse steadily against her hand, like a second heartbeat that wasn't hers. Her mate was close. He had crossed into the territory. Above her, the ceremony continued. The drums resumed. Feet moved across the ceremony stones. And somewhere in the sounds filtering down through the crack, Astrid heard the particular quality of a crowd reacting to an arrival, the kind of arrival that made even proud wolves straighten their spines without meaning to. She had no way to see who had come. She only had the warmth in her chest, growing stronger with every breath. She hadn't always been the girl in the hollow. There had been a time, not long ago, though it felt like someone else's life, when Astrid Ironville had walked this border territory with her chin up and her shoulders back, the way her father had taught her, when the pack had known her name not as an absence or a problem to be managed, but as a presence, when she had believed, with the full and uncomplicated faith of someone who had never been given reason to doubt, that she belonged here. Her father had been Beta Aldrich. Not an alpha, never an alpha, but the kind of man who didn't need the title to carry weight. He was respected in the specific way that people who do things correctly and quietly for decades eventually earn, not with fanfare but with trust. The older pack members brought their problems to him. The younger wolves watched him work. And Astrid, his only child, had followed at his heels from the time she could walk and absorbed everything he was willing to teach. He had taught her a great deal. Pack law, bond languages, the formal ones, and 3 of the old territorial dialects that most wolves considered too dry to bother with. The border histories, how to read the old stone markers for signs of crossing, how to sit with someone grieving without filling the silence with words they didn't need, how to tell the difference between a threat that was real and a threat that was simply being performed. That last lesson had turned out to be the most useful of all. She just hadn't known it at the time. She had been 16 when he died. A border ambush on the eastern crossing, the most dangerous stretch of Ironville territory, and everyone knew it. And Aldrich had gone anyway because someone always had to, and he was the one the pack trusted with the difficult things. A young pack messenger had arrived at the house before dawn, still carrying the dust of a long run, and the expression on his face had told her everything before he opened his mouth. She hadn't cried in front of him. She had held herself together through the conversation and the arrangements and the first terrible hours of the day, and she had not cried until she was alone that evening, sitting by the border stone where she and Aldrich had spent solstice evenings together, pressing her forehead against the cold rock and letting the grief move through her like weather. She had given herself until morning. Then she had stood up, straightened her spine, and walked back to figure out what came next. What came next was Ragnvald. He arrived at the burial with his family. His wife Sigrid, composed and carefully kind in the practiced way of people who have performed kindness so long it no longer requires feeling anything. And his daughter Freydis, 17 and golden-haired, and already possessed of the kind of beauty that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. Ragnvald delivered a speech at the burial that would have made Aldrich deeply uncomfortable, too many words, too much performance, but that the gathered pack received with grateful tears. He put his hand on Astrid's shoulder afterward and said, quietly, "You don't have to carry this alone." She had believed him. She had been so terribly wrong. It happened slowly, the way the worst things always did, not a sudden theft but a patient erosion. Ragnvald stepped into the role of pack leader temporary, he insisted, until Astrid came of age and could formally claim her father's position. He made decisions, reasonable ones at first, reorganizing the border patrol schedule, renegotiating the grain agreements with the southern territories, settling a boundary dispute in the west that had been dragging on for 2 seasons. The pack was grateful. They were tired and needed stability, and Ragnvald gave them that. And somewhere in those first months, very quietly, he stopped consulting Astrid. She noticed, she said something. He listened with great patience, nodded at everything she said, and then continued exactly as he had planned. When she cited pack law, he cited her youth. When she cited her father's precedent, he expressed gentle concern about whether grief was affecting her judgment. When she went around him to the older council members, she found that they had already been spoken to, not warned off exactly, but managed, the way Ragnvald managed everything, through small, reasonable conversations that left people feeling heard and changed nothing at all. Sigrid was subtler and therefore more effective. She never raised her voice. She never said anything directly unkind. She simply began treating Astrid as a background feature of the household, noticed in the absent way one noticed furniture, useful for certain things, not consulted about anything that mattered. She rerouted invitations. She redirected conversations. She established, through 100 small social maneuvers over 2 years, that Astrid's presence at pack events was tolerated rather than wanted. Freydis, to her credit, did not appear to enjoy any of it, but she benefited from all of it, and she never once said so. The morning of the border ceremony, Ragnvald had called Astrid into his study at sunrise. He poured tea. She would remember that detail later, the domestic normalcy of it, the deliberate pleasantness, and he told her, in his kind and reasonable voice, that the Alpha King himself was attending the ceremony tonight. She had gone very still. The Alpha King. Torin Blackriver, he has been conducting the border ceremonies in the outer territories this season. Ours is the last. Ragnvald turned his cup in his hands, unhurried. The bond will be felt tonight. Freydis will be at the boundary. That isn't how the bond works, Astrid said carefully. It chooses, you can't direct it. No, Ragnvald agreed pleasantly, but it responds to proximity. And you, he looked at her with something in his eyes that was almost pity, will not be at the boundary tonight. She had argued, she had cited law, she had asked him, and this was the part that still sent heat through her face in the dark. She had actually asked him to reconsider, as if he were a reasonable man who simply hadn't thought this through. He had listened to all of it with his hands folded and his expression calm. Then he said, "The ceremony begins at dusk. I suggest you make peace with what is." When she stood to leave, Ulfric was at the door. She had fought, that mattered to her. She had not gone quietly. She had kicked and called out every name she knew until her voice broke. But Ulfric was large, and the hollow was old, and by the time the stone rolled into place, there had been nothing left to do but sit in the dark and wait for everything she was supposed to have to be handed to someone else. She pressed her spine against the ancestor marks and breathed. And then, 2 hours into the dark, the warmth had come. That was when she remembered the last thing her father had ever taught her, not pack law, not history, something older than both. She and Aldrich had been sitting by the border stone on a solstice evening when she was 12 years old, and he had pressed her palm flat against the carved marks in the granite and said, in the patient, specific way he always said the things he thought she might need one day, that the mate bond was older than every law ever written, that it was not a feeling but a language, and that if she was ever silenced, she could speak through it. Push your need through the thread, he had told her, your fear, your hope, your exact location if you know it. Push everything you have through the connection and it will find its other end. Distance matters less than you think. Stone matters less than you think. He had looked at her with his steady grey eyes. The bond always finds its other end, always. She had thought it a beautiful story at 12. She was not 12 anymore. The ceremony above followed its rhythm. Astrid had attended the border ceremony every year since she was old enough to stand still through its full length, and she knew its structure the way she knew her own name. Opening horn, elder's declaration, territorial roll call, formal presentation of those eligible for the bond, and then the silence in which the moon goddess did or did not answer. She knew every beat of it. Lying in the dust of the hollow with her ear pressed to the stone floor, she followed it by sound alone. The horn, the shuffle of formal positioning, Dagmar's real opening words this time, the ancient ceremony declaration, not the one about her death, but the words of welcome and boundary setting that began every border ceremony across every territory in the known world. She knew them well enough to mouth them in the dark, her lips forming the syllables without sound. Then Ragnvald's performance voice. She recognized it immediately, smooth and warm, and precisely calibrated for an audience he wanted to impress. On behalf of the Ironville Pack, he said above her, we welcome the Alpha King and offer the bond right in accordance with the old pact. We present, as is tradition, those of our house who have reached the age of bond eligibility. Astrid's jaw tightened. She heard Freydis's footsteps. She knew those footsteps, the measured, deliberate pace of someone who had been trained to carry herself like a presentation since childhood, the whisper of formal silk across stone, the collective breath of the assembled pack as Freydis took her place at the boundary. And then silence. A silence that went on too long. In a normal border ceremony, the silence after presentation was brief, a breath or two while the bond confirmed or did not confirm. This silence was different. This silence had weight and edges and a specific quality that made the assembled wolves stop moving. Her wolf went utterly still inside her chest. The mate bond in her sternum pulled sharp and hard toward the north wall, toward a presence above and ahead of her that had gone from approaching to arrived. She could feel the warmth of it pressing against her from the other side of stone and ceremony and 2 years of careful planning, and it was insisting in a way nothing had ever insisted before. Then she heard his voice for the first time. It reached her through 2 feet of solid stone, muffled and altered by distance and rock, and it was still the most certain sound she had ever heard in her life. Not loud, not theatrical, the kind of voice that never needed to fill a room because rooms arranged themselves to hear it. He said 4 words. This is not her. Astrid stopped breathing. Above her. The ceremony fractured, not into chaos, into the sharp, layered quality of a formal event that had just become something else entirely. Multiple conversations starting at once, feet shifting, someone dropping something small and metallic that rang against the ceremony stones. Freydis's voice, higher than usual, reaching for composure and finding the edges of it. Your Majesty, I am Freydis, daughter of acting Alpha Ragnvald. I was presented in accordance with. I heard the presentation, his voice again, still level, still absolutely certain. It doesn't change what I know, you are not the woman the moon goddess chose for me. Perhaps the bond simply requires, that was Sigrid, the smooth, practiced tone of a woman who had redirected 1,000 conversations and fully intended to redirect this one. The journey was long, Your Majesty, and the bond sometimes needs proximity over time before. Do not, he said, and even through stone Astrid felt the authority in those 2 words like a change in pressure. Explain my wolf to me. The silence that followed was the kind that came before storms. My mate is in this territory. His voice dropped half a register, and it was somehow louder for it. She is close. I can feel her heartbeat, and the fact that not one of you looks surprised by this tells me that someone in this pack knows exactly where she is. Astrid's hand flew to her mouth. He knew she didn't understand how they had never met, had never been within a territory of each other. The bond shouldn't have been strong enough at this distance to carry location, but he knew. And from the way the sounds above changed, the way voices began speaking at once, and then cut off sharply, the way Ragnvald's carefully constructed performance voice developed its first crack. He was right, and he knew he was right, and everyone in that courtyard was becoming aware that there was no version of this night where Ragnvald's plans survived contact with the Alpha King's wolf. "You have until I count to 5, Torin said, to tell me where she is." Dead silence. 1. Astrid pressed both palms flat against the floor above her head and pushed herself to standing. Her legs had gone half numb from sitting in the cold, but she made herself stand, because whatever happened next, she was not going to be found sitting in the dust. 2. The sound of boots on stone above, his boots, deliberate and unhurried, moving away from the ceremony center, toward the north wall, toward her. 3. "Your Majesty," Sigrid's voice, the smoothness was cracking now just slightly, just enough. "There is truly no one else. Our ward Astrid, she was lost at the border crossing just this afternoon. We are all of us still in shock." 4. The word fell like a stone into still water. And in the silence stretched between 4 and 5, a voice, older, rougher, unsteady with something that lived between guilt and relief, said, "The hollow, north wall. There is a sealed hollow in the north wall." Astrid recognized the voice immediately. Bjarne, old Bjarne, who had served alongside her father for 20 years and who had looked at her across the ceremony preparations that afternoon with eyes that couldn't quite hold hers. Who had known, she understood now, and had carried it, and had finally, at 4.5, set it down. She hoped when this was over that she remembered to thank him. The sounds above changed immediately. Not chaos, purposeful movement, the kind that happened when a very large and very focused person had been given a direction and intended to cover it without stopping. She heard the crowd part. She heard Ragnvald say something sharp and tight that she couldn't make out. She heard the Alpha King's guard, 4 of them at least, by the footfall pattern, taking positions around the courtyard. And she heard Torin's boots heading directly, and without hesitation, toward the north wall. Astrid knew the hollow's geography. She had spent 3 hours memorizing every inch of it the way she'd learned to memorize anything she might need to survive, methodically, completely, without sentiment. The entrance from outside was a narrow gap behind the decorative stone column at the base of the ceremony wall. Ulfric had known exactly where to find it, which meant Ragnvald had been planning this for much longer than she'd realized. The column was sealed back into position. It would take significant strength to move. She had the feeling that strength was not going to be an issue. But from the ceremony side, the hollow's entrance wasn't marked. The column looked like every other column on the wall. Without exact directions, Torin could lose precious minutes searching. She tried to call out. She pressed her face toward the crack in the ceiling and pushed every bit of air her raw throat could produce through that sliver of stone and distance. The ceremony drums started up again. Someone trying to restore order had set the drums going, and her voice vanished completely. She stopped, breathed, thought. Her father's voice came to her the way it always did when she was frightened, and trying to think clearly, patient, specific, with the quality of someone who had saved the most important thing for exactly the right moment. She reached inward for the first time in her life with real intention. The thread was there. She hadn't been imagining the warmth. It had texture and direction. She could feel it now that she was genuinely reaching, the way you could feel a key in your pocket before you pulled it out. Warm and certain, and pointing north and slightly upward, and pulling with the urgency of something that had been looking for an anchor for a very long time. She wrapped both hands around it in her mind, the way you'd wrap your hands around a rope in fast water when letting go isn't a choice, and she pushed. Everything, her location, specific and physical, the hollow, the north wall behind the stone column 10 feet down, her state, alive, unhurt, sealed in, waiting, her need, the specific, desperate shape of 3 hours of fear and cold and stubborn hope, compressed into something without words, because words weren't the language the bond used. The effect was immediate. Above her, in the middle of the moving crowd, the Alpha King stopped. She felt it through the thread before she heard it in the sounds above, a stillness that hit her end of the bond like a door swinging open. And then through that stillness, something came back the other direction. Not words, not a message. just the quality of him, reaching her through the bond directly for the very first time, a controlled, vast fury, and underneath it, in the place the fury was protecting, a relief so enormous it had no visible bottom. He had felt her, he knew where she was. There, she heard him say above, his voice rougher now than it had been during the ceremony, stripped of its formal register, working from something more immediate. Behind the column, the entrance is behind that column. The crowd parted, the deep grinding scrape of stone on stone, something very heavy being moved by someone who was not bothering to move it carefully. Ragnvald's voice, sharp and urgent, saying her name, her actual name, in a tone that had lost every trace of its managed composure, and Harvard's voice, clean and final, cutting across it. "Stand back, by order of the Alpha King." The scraping grew louder, the hairline crack above her widened by a fraction. Then a fraction more. Then Astrid did something she hadn't permitted herself in 3 hours. She let herself believe this was going to be all right. She heard the stone give before she saw it happen. A sound like the world deciding it had been patient long enough, a deep structural crack running from somewhere at the base of the hollow all the way up through the ceiling, sending a cascade of fine dust raining down into her upturned face. The crack above her head split wide. The torchlight that had been a sliver became a wedge, became a column, became a sudden and total blaze that after 3 hours of darkness made her press her arm across her eyes. The ceiling opened. Not crumbled, not collapsed. Pushed, she understood distantly, from the outside, with a force that had nothing to do with tools and everything to do with a wolf who had stopped accepting the word obstacle as something that applied to him. She heard boots hit the hollow floor. He had not waited for a rope, he had simply dropped. Astrid lowered her arm and found the Alpha King crouching in front of her. She would try to describe him later, in the weeks that followed, when people asked, and people always asked, because the story spread across 5 territories in less than a fortnight. She would say that the first thing she registered was not his height, which was considerable, or the width of his shoulders, which had been the first thing most of the witnesses above had noticed when he arrived in the courtyard. She would say it was his eyes. They were amber, not the ordinary amber of a wolf whose emotions ran high, but a deep, burning gold that came from somewhere internal, from the wolf pressing forward behind them, recognizing her at a level that was older than language or law or anything that had happened tonight. But his hands, when they reached for her face, were gentle. That was what broke 3 hours of carefully maintained calm, not the cracked wall or the dropped ceiling or the sound of the rescue unfolding above them. The gentleness of someone who had just removed a wall with his bare hands and was now touching her like she was made of something worth being careful with. His thumbs moved across her cheeks and came away dusty. He looked at the dust on his thumbs for exactly 1 moment with an expression that had nothing to do with ceremony or title or the Alpha King of the known territories. It was grief, plain and simple, that she had been here at all. "You," he said, his voice was rougher than it had been above. "I felt you calling, I felt your fear before I felt your location." His jaw tightened visibly. "They sealed you inside the wall." "Yes," Astrid said, "because there was no version of this that required softening." "Are you hurt?" She took inventory quickly, cold through to the bone. Both hands scraped from 2 hours of pounding stone, her voice raw and broken at the edges, but nothing that wouldn't heal. "No," she said, "they only needed me gone, not harmed." Something moved through his expression at the word only, as if the casual way she had said it told him more about the last 2 years than a longer explanation could have managed. "Tell me your name." Astrid Ironville. "My father was Peter Aldrich." She held his gaze. "He died 2 years ago. I have been in Ragnvald's household since then." "Not anymore." 2 words, said quietly, said with the specific certainty of a man whose word became fact simply by being spoken. He sat back slightly, watching her, and she watched him absorb the situation, the hollow, the dust, the 3 hours, the careful and public lie that had been declared over her name, and she watched his composure hold over something that was working very hard against it. "Torin," he said, offering his name with the particular care of someone giving something they considered important. Torin Blackriver, a pause. You called to me through the bond. Most wolves don't know that's possible. My father taught me. Something shifted in his expression, warmer, more present. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was. The past tense sat between them for a moment, acknowledged, and then carefully set aside, because this was not the moment, and they both understood it without discussion. He looked at her, she looked at him. The mate bond, which had been pulling them toward each other through stone and ceremony and a declared death for the better part of 3 hours, sat warm and completely certain in both their chests. He held out his hand. She looked at it for one breath, then she took it. The moment their palms met, the bond completed itself. It was nothing like she had imagined. She had expected something enormous and theatrical, lightning, or a sound like a great bell, or some dramatic signal that the thing had happened. What she got instead was the sensation of something clicking into place that she hadn't known was misaligned. A warmth that moved from her palm through her entire body in a single slow wave, settling into every part of her that had been cold and braced and tightly held. Her wolf went still in the specific way of an animal that has arrived somewhere safe after a very long run. Torin's grip on her hand tightened. His eyes went briefly closed, the amber light behind them flaring and then steadying into something calmer. When he opened them again, they were clearer, more focused, more like a person and less like a force of nature. There, he said quietly, to himself as much as to her. Yes, she agreed. They stood like that for exactly 2 breaths. Then from above them, Harvard's voice reporting in low tones to no one in particular, and the sound of it reminded them both simultaneously that there were 40 wolves in the ceremony courtyard, and the situation above had not resolved itself simply because the situation below it had. Torin looked up at the gap in the ceiling, too high for Astrid to reach without assistance, and then back at her. I'm going to lift you through, he said, and then I'm coming up, and then we are going to go upstairs and finish this. He held her gaze, together. She had been prepared for a lot of things tonight. She had not been particularly prepared for that word. All right, she said. He lifted her through the gap, as if the logistics of it was something he'd simply decided in advance. She caught the edge of the opening and pulled herself up into the night air of the ceremony courtyard, cool and open and enormous after 3 hours of stone walls, and for a moment she simply stood there breathing, feeling the space around her like a gift. Then she turned and saw the crowd. 40 wolves, every one of them looking at her, at the woman who had been formally declared dead at the opening of the evening, now standing in the torchlight with dust in her hair and stone marks on her palms. The silence in the courtyard was extraordinary. Then Torin came up through the gap behind her, moving with a particular ease that suggested he'd dealt with more difficult obstacles than a 10-foot drop on a fairly regular basis, and stood at her shoulder, and the silence changed character entirely. Ragnvald was standing 20 feet away. He had found his composure. That was the first thing Astrid noticed, that even now, even with everything unraveling, he had located the time to arrange his expression into something that walked the precise line between shock and deep concern, as if he were a bystander, as if he were a man receiving unexpected news and doing his best to process it with grace. Sigrid stood at his shoulder, 1 step behind and slightly to his right, the position she always took when he was performing, because her stillness made his composure look more natural by comparison. Frades was not performing anything. She was standing with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at Astrid with an expression that had no calculation in it whatsoever. Just the raw, uncurated look of a young woman understanding, all at once, the full size of what her parents had done. Torin stepped forward. He did not move Astrid behind him. He positioned himself beside her, and then, a gesture so deliberate it could only have been intentional, he moved her half a step forward of himself, not shielded, presented. This, he said, in the carrying voice that needed no particular volume to fill a space, is Astrid Ironville, daughter of Beta Aldrich, the woman the moon goddess chose as my mate, the woman who was sealed inside the border hollow and declared dead tonight so that another could stand in her place at this ceremony. The collective inhale of 40 wolves was audible. Your Majesty, Ragnvald moved forward, not backward. He was too careful for that. By one step, establishing presence without retreat. His reasonable voice had returned. There has been a terrible confusion tonight. Astrid went missing this afternoon before the ceremony, and we feared the worst. We are overjoyed, truly overjoyed, to see her safe and stable. One word, said without raising his voice. It ended Ragnvald's sentence and every sentence that might have followed it. I arrived in your territory 4 hours ago, Torin said. In that time, your elder declared my mate dead to a gathered ceremony audience. Your daughter was presented to me in her place, and my mate was found sealed inside your ceremonial border wall with stone marks on her hands from trying to get out. He let that sit for a moment in the night air. Tell me again about the confusion. Ragnvald's composure held. She would give him that, it held. But it thinned, visibly, like ice going transparent under pressure, and the two older council members nearest to him took a sideways step that they probably didn't realize they were taking. She was not harmed, Sigrid said. Her voice was still level, and the bond has clearly found its resolution. Surely the priority now is to. The priority, Torin said, is this. He reached into the front of his formal coat and produced a folded document sealed in the black wax of the crown. Harvard, Astrid noted, had prepared it with remarkable efficiency in the preceding minutes, which suggested Harvard prepared for many scenarios. Under the Pact of the Moon, which the Ironville territory signed 3 generations ago and which I carry the authority to enforce. Interfering with a mate bond during a formal ceremony is grounds for exile from all Pact territories under Crown protection. Attempting to deceive the Alpha King during that ceremony carries the same penalty, applied permanently and without appeal. The word permanently fell into the courtyard like something that displaced air. Ragnvald went very still. Sigrid's carefully maintained posture lost something essential, something that had been holding it up from the inside. You cannot do this, Ragnvald said, and for the first time all evening, the voice behind the words was his actual voice, not the performance, not the reasonable tone, something smaller and tighter and considerably less impressive. This is my pack. This is my territory. I built something here after Aldrich. After Aldrich, Torin said quietly, died. Yes, I know what you built. He looked at Astrid for exactly one beat, and what passed across his expression in that beat would stay with her for a long time. Then he looked back. Captain Harvard. Harvard stepped forward with the unhurried movement of a man who had been awaiting this particular instruction. Escort Ragnvald and Sigrid to the border, Torin said. They have until sunrise to collect whatever they can carry. After that, the Ironville territory and all its holdings revert to their rightful heir. He looked at Astrid when he said the last part. By blood and lineage, Aldrich's daughter. Astrid had not been expecting that. She kept her face still. 2 years in Ragnvald's household had made her very good at keeping her face still, but something shifted in her chest. Something that had been compressed for a long, long time and was testing carefully whether the pressure had actually lifted. Frades made a sound, not a word, just a short, compressed exhale, the sound of someone understanding something all at once and finding the weight of it more than they'd prepared for. Frades, Torin's voice, directed at her, lost some of its edge, not all but enough. You will be given the opportunity to present your account of tonight's events before the Territorial Council. Your parents' choices are not automatically yours. What happens next for you depends on what you say and whether it is true. Frades met his gaze for one moment, then she looked at Astrid. And in her expression, beneath the golden composure that had been trained into her since childhood, Astrid saw something she hadn't expected. Not an apology exactly, because they had not been close enough for that to mean what it needed to mean, but an acknowledgement, the specific look of someone who had benefited from a wrong thing and was, finally, calling it what it was. Then Harvard's guards were moving, and the moment passed. Ragnvald did not go quietly. He gave a final speech, citing precedent and injury and the Pact's best interests, and it was the best version of all his speeches, practiced and reasonable, and landing on empty air, because every wolf in the courtyard had seen what was in the hollow behind the north wall. Sigrid did not make a sound, not one. She walked out of the Ironville territory with her spine straight and her face composed and her eyes fixed forward, and there was something in her absolute composure, Astrid thought, that was almost sadder than if she had argued. When they were gone, and the sound of their departure had faded, and the courtyard took its first real breath, Torin turned to her. "Are you all right?" "I've been better," Astrid said honestly, "but yes." From somewhere in the gathered crowd, old Bjarne moved forward. He was broad and grizzled, and his eyes were doing something very complicated when he reached her. He pressed her hands in both hands, the way the older wolves did when words fell short of what was needed. "I should have spoken sooner," he said, his voice rough in a way that had nothing to do with age. "When I understood what Ulfric was doing this afternoon, he started again. Your father would be standing a great deal taller than me right now." "He would have understood," Astrid said. "Ragnvald is very convincing when he needs to be. You spoke when it counted." Bjarne pressed her hands once more, nodded like a man making a private promise, and stepped back. Astrid looked around the courtyard. The ceremony torches were still burning. The altar stones were still in their formation. The moon, which had watched everything with complete impartiality from above, was fully risen now, flooding the border wall with clean silver light. The wall, the hollow, the column still sitting at its wrong angle, displaced by significant force, the gap in the stone still open to the air behind it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then Torin came to stand beside her, not reaching for her hand, not directing her attention anywhere, simply standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and looked at the wall alongside her. "We should complete the ceremony," he said quietly, "if you're willing." Astrid turned to look at him. In the torchlight, with his formal collar slightly displaced, and his amber eyes returned to something steadier than they had been, he looked less like the weight of his title and more like a person. One who had traveled a considerable distance to find something and had found it under circumstances neither of them would have chosen. "I'm willing," she said. Something in his expression shifted. "We've only just met." "I know," she looked at the bond between them, she could feel it, settled and certain, and completely uninterested in the opinions of anyone who had tried to interfere with it. "But I have been feeling you coming for 3 hours. That is a strange kind of knowing. It counts for something." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Yes," he said, "it does." The ceremony altar was exactly as it should have been. Dagmar stood between the two carved boundary stones, his officiating staff in his hand, and an expression that carried the particular weight of a man who understood completely that what he said next would need to be very, very correct. He had, without being told, set the candles back in their formation and reopened the ceremony register. Whether this was guilt or professionalism, Astrid wasn't certain it mattered. The gathered wolves had closed into the proper witness circle, a different circle from the one at the start of the evening, shifted, rearranged, charged with something the opening ceremony had not contained. Torin offered her his arm, formally, in the traditional ceremony gesture, as if the last 2 hours had been a preamble, and this was the thing that had always been scheduled to happen at the border ceremony tonight. She took his arm and felt the warmth of him through his formal sleeve, and did her best to look like someone whose hands were not shaking with something between exhaustion and relief, and the specific, overwhelming feeling of being on the correct side of a locked door for the first time in 2 years. They walked to the altar stones together. Alpha King Torin Blackriver. Dagmar's voice had recovered its ceremony register, though it had lost something underneath, and both of them knew it. "Do you present yourself freely at this boundary, before the moon goddess and these witnesses, to claim and be claimed by the mate the goddess has chosen for you?" "I do," steady, his eyes on her. Astrid Ironvale, daughter of the Ironvale line. A slight catch in Dagmar's voice on her name, she gave him credit for not flinching away from it. "Do you present yourself freely at this boundary, before the moon goddess and these witnesses, to claim and be claimed by the mate the goddess has chosen for you?" Astrid thought about everything this answer was going to change. Not just tonight, every morning after tonight, the pack, the territory her father had served, what she was allowed to be, and who would decide that from now on. She thought of Aldrich's voice by the border stone. She thought of the hollow. She thought of the warmth in her chest that had pulled her through 3 hours of dark and found its other end exactly as her father had promised it would. "I do," she said, and her voice came out clear and strong and surprised her. "Then by the authority of the old pact," Dagmar raised his staff, "and in the sight of the moon goddess who made this bond before any wall was built, I declare it recognized and sealed. What the goddess has joined, no power of wolf or stone shall put apart." The mate bond settled. That was the only word for what happened, not a dramatic surge or a flash of something visible. It simply settled, the way something that has been suspended for a long time finally finds its ground and stays there. A warmth that moved through Astrid from the center outward in a single wave, reaching into every part of her that had been cold and braced, and tightly held against the possibility of disappointment. Her wolf made a sound she had never heard before, not the internal growl of alarm or the bristling of distress, something low and open, like a long exhale after a very long run. Torin reached up and touched her face with 2 fingers, tilting her chin up, carefully, in the way of someone taking something seriously. "May I?" he asked. No one had asked her that for anything in a very long time. "Yes," she said. He kissed her once, gently, briefly, in the way of someone who intended this to be the beginning of a long series of careful decisions. When he pulled back, his eyes had gone to their deepest amber, and his expression had the quality of something that had been carried a very long distance and was finally being set down. "Mine," he said quietly, not a command, an arrival. "Yours," Astrid agreed, and then, because the equality of it had mattered to her before tonight and would matter to her after, "and mine, that is how this works." Something crossed his expression. Brief and transformative, it took the authority and the amber intensity and the weight of his title and replaced them, just for a moment, with something entirely human and unexpectedly warm. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." Around them, the witness circle began the low ceremony call of acknowledgement, the sound that moved through a crowd as each wolf added their voice in turn, building from one to many, until the courtyard was full of it, and the border wall was full of it, and the night itself seemed to carry it upward. And Astrid, who had spent 2 years making herself invisible in the pack her father had served, stood in the torchlight with dust in her hair and stone marks on her hands, and the Alpha King's fingers laced through hers, and she let herself be seen. It was not as difficult as she had expected. The carriages were waiting at the edge of the ceremony grounds. Royal carriages, black wood with silver fittings, the Black River crest worked into the door panels, and Harvard had organized the route and timing and every other practical detail with the quiet efficiency of someone who considered anticipating outcomes to be simply part of the work. Astrid stood at the edge of the grounds while Torin spoke with his captain in low tones, and she tried to take stock of what had happened. Ragnvald and Sigrid were gone. The territory was hers. Dagmar was waiting somewhere in the courtyard for a conversation he was not looking forward to. Bjarne had disappeared in the direction of the pack meeting house, probably to begin the series of honest conversations that always followed the end of a dishonest administration. And she was leaving, tonight, in those carriages, toward a palace she had never seen, with a man she had known for approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes. It was possible, she thought, that this evening had contained too many events. "You've gone very quiet." Torin had finished with Harvard and come to stand beside her in his unhurried way. She was already learning the rhythm of him, the deliberate calm that wasn't distance, but attention. He was always paying attention. "I'm thinking," she said. "About everything." She looked at the territory spread out in the dark around them, the border wall, the ceremony stones, the ordinary pack buildings that had been the edges of her world for 2 years. "I spent 2 years being told I was a burden, that I didn't fit, that my presence made things difficult." She paused. "Tonight I found out that the most powerful wolf in the known territories had been looking for me, that the bond was pointing at me the entire time." She looked at him. "That is a significant amount of information to hold at once." He looked at her steadily. "Do you need time?" No, she said it before fully processing it, then realized it was true. I think what I need is to stop standing on the ground where I spent 3 hours sealed in a wall. Something crossed his expression, not quite a smile, but close to one, and clearly something he didn't do often because it looked slightly unpracticed. Then let's go. He offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked toward the carriages. Inside, with the horses moving and the ceremony grounds falling away behind them, Astrid let herself sit back against the padded seat and breathe all the way out for the first time in hours. The carriage swayed gently. Through the window, the last thing she could make out of Ironville territory was the border wall, solid and old, and cracked now, one column sitting at its wrong angle, the hollow open to the night air. She watched it until it disappeared. "Tell me what you want to know," Torin said. He was sitting across from her, his long legs angled slightly to fit the carriage's dimensions, his formal attire still slightly disordered from the evening's events in a way that Harvard would address eventually, and Astrid found oddly comforting. He looked like someone who had been in a real situation, not a ceremony. "What does the day look like?" she asked. "Practically, not the title, the actual day." He seemed to appreciate that she'd asked the practical version. Council in the mornings when the territorial business requires it, which is most mornings. Formal events approximately twice a month, regional ceremonies, interpack agreements, that kind of thing. The rest of the time is genuinely yours to build what you choose to build with it. He held her gaze. "Your decisions carry weight, not in a ceremonial sense, in a real one. The pacts that answer to me will answer to you." "That will take some adjustment," she said it honestly. "I have spent 2 years being someone whose opinions were not requested." "I know," he said, "which is why I'm telling you now before we arrive, so it doesn't catch you off guard when it happens." A pause. "I also want you to know that no means no. If something is asked of you that you are not willing to do, that is a complete sentence." She looked at him across the small space of the carriage. "You're saying that to someone who just spent 3 hours in a sealed wall because she refused to cooperate with a plan she found unjust." "I know what I'm saying it to," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." The carriage rolled on through the dark. The night landscape moved past the window, the outer edges of Ironville territory giving way to the open road between territories, wide and pale in the moonlight. "Tell me something about yourself," she said, "not about being the Alpha King." A surprised pause. The kind that suggested this was not a question he encountered frequently. "I know all 47 border songs in the old territories," he said, after a moment's genuine consideration. "The long ones, the ones that take 3 hours to sing from start to finish. My grandmother taught me before she died, and I have never in 15 years of territorial governance had a single occasion to mention this." Astrid stared at him. "My father knew the border songs. He used to sing the shorter ones when we walked the territory line." "Which ones?" She told him, and he told her the versions he knew. There were regional variations she hadn't been aware of, slight differences in the third verse of the River Calling song that turned out to have an interesting territorial history behind them. And they were still talking when the carriage crested a long hill, and the palace appeared below. A sprawling complex of towers and lit windows and courtyards that occupied the landscape the way something that had always belonged there occupied it, without effort, without announcement, simply present. Astrid went quiet. The descriptions she'd been given over the years had not been wrong, exactly. They had just failed to capture the scale of it. "It looks very large," she said. "It is very large," Torin agreed. "Most of it is empty. The inhabited section is smaller than it appears from outside." He watched her watching the palace. "You don't have to like it immediately." "I'm keeping an open mind," she said. "I've had a complicated evening." "That seems reasonable." The carriage moved down toward the gates, and Astrid watched the palace grow and thought about everything that had ended today and everything that was, very carefully, beginning. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For coming through the wall," she said, "for not accepting Sigrid's explanation, for..." She stopped, because the list was getting long and she wasn't sure she had the right words for all of it yet. "For the word we," she finished. "When you said we were going upstairs to finish this, I wasn't expecting that." He was quiet for a moment. I have been conducting border ceremonies for 11 years, he said. 11 ceremonies. 11 times, standing at the boundary wondering if the moon goddess had simply, he paused. I had begun to think perhaps the bond was something that happened to other people. And when it happened to you, someone had put me in a wall. Yes, a long, quiet beat. When it happened to me, someone had put you in a wall. He looked at her with those amber eyes that had gone quiet and steady in the carriage light. I want you to understand something. Every wall between us tonight was removed. Every single one. Whatever comes next, the adjustment, the learning, the things that will inevitably be harder than expected, none of it will involve walls, not if I have any say in it. Astrid held his gaze. The mate bond sat warm and settled and perfectly certain in her chest. All right, she said. The carriage passed through the palace gates. 3 months later, the Ironville border gardens were blooming. They had been Aldrich's project, a narrow strip of cultivated space along the inside of the territorial wall, planted with things that came back every year without being asked. Wild roses, frost-hardy lavender, a row of silver-leaf trees that Astrid still didn't know the name of but whose smell she associated completely and permanently with her father. The gardens had been neglected under Ragnvald's administration. 2 months ago, Astrid had sent a clear and specific instruction from the palace regarding their restoration. She was standing in them now, running her palm along the new growth on the lavender, when she heard Torin's boots on the garden path behind her. She knew his footsteps by now. She probably would have known them regardless. The mate bond kept a sort of general awareness of him, the way you were always aware of a fire in a room, the warmth of him registering before conscious thought could catch up. Council ran late, she asked without turning. Territorial dispute. 2 lesser alphas in the eastern corridor who have been arguing about a river boundary since before either of us was born. He came to stand beside her, still in his council clothes, his formal jacket removed at some point in the last hour and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. It is resolved. Temporarily, probably. The river shifted course 2 seasons ago, Astrid said. The dispute will recur unless someone redraws the boundary reference to the new channel position. He looked at her. How do you know that? Biana's report from last month. He mentioned the river in passing. I looked it up in the territorial history after. She checked the lavender stem in her hand. If you want, I can draft a resolution framework using the old boundary shifting protocols. There's a precedent from the 3rd generation of the Pact that covers exactly this kind of geographical change. There was a pause. My council spent 4 hours on this today, Torin said slowly. I know, I heard them in the corridor. She finally turned to look at him. I did not think it was my place to interrupt. Astrid, his voice had the quality it got when he was being very deliberate. You are the Lunar Queen. It is absolutely your place to interrupt. She held his gaze. 3 months ago, she wouldn't have been able to do that without bracing herself for what would follow. I'm learning, she said simply. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair away from her face, a gesture that had become familiar over 3 months, the specific gentleness of it unchanged from the first time he'd touched her face in the hollow, and looked at her with that amber gaze that she had learned meant he was about to say something he had been thinking about for longer than the moment suggested. Do you remember, he said, what you told me in the carriage that first night, about building something your father would recognize? Yes. The sanctuary program you established for orphaned wolves in the outer territories. He looked at her steadily. The 3 pack members who have come forward in the last month to report similar situations to Astrid's, to your situation, and been protected under the new provisions you wrote. The Ironville Pack Council, which now has 2 women on it for the first time in 40 years because you asked a simple question about why it didn't. He paused. Biana sent a letter last week. He said the pack feels like itself again. He said Aldrich would know the place. Something moved through her chest that was neither the bond nor grief, but both at once. The specific feeling of a thing you have worked toward arriving, quietly, without announcing itself. That's not me alone, she said. Most of that is the backing of Crown authority, without. The backing of Crown authority is available to many people, Torin said. They do not all use it for the same things. He looked at her with those steady amber eyes. You chose what to build with it. That is you." She looked at him in the evening light of the border garden, this man who had heard her heartbeat through solid stone and removed a wall to reach her and had spent 3 months treating as if it were the obvious and only way to organize a life shared between two people. She had not been prepared for him to be so genuinely good at it. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it in the full light of day, in an open garden where any member of the palace household walking the grounds might hear it. They had said it before, the first time late at night, 3 weeks ago, in the quiet of his chambers where the darkness had made it easier, but this was different. Daytime love was a different kind of declaration, more permanent, more witnessed. Torin went completely still. Then something moved through his expression, through all that composure and authority and deliberate calm, and broke the surface, and she saw what was underneath. The 11 years of border ceremonies, the long accumulated patience of someone who had waited so long for a thing that he had almost stopped believing it was coming. "I love you," he said, and then, quieter, "I have been practicing saying that for approximately 6 weeks in case the opportunity arose." Astrid looked at him. "You've been practicing." "I wanted to say it correctly." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she rose up on her toes and kissed him, not gently and briefly the way the ceremony kiss had been, but properly, the way people kissed when they had decided something and were announcing it to themselves as much as to each other. When she pulled back, his hands were at her waist and his eyes were the warmest amber she had ever seen in them. "You said it correctly," she told him. He laughed. It was her favorite version of him, the one almost no one else got to see, where all the authority fell away and he was simply a person who was happy. "Did I?" "Exactly correctly." She stayed where she was, in the circle of his arms, in the garden her father had planted before she was born. "I had no corrections." He pressed his forehead against hers in the way that had become theirs over 3 months. A specific, quiet kind of closeness that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with the particular piece of two people who had found each other and were still, every day, finding out what that meant. "What would you like to do tonight?" he asked. "Something ordinary," she said. "I have had enough extraordinary events to last me the better part of a year." "Dinner then. The kitchen's made the lamb stew you asked about last week." "That is an extremely ordinary thing to look forward to." "I know," he offered his arm. "I thought you'd appreciate that." She took his arm and they walked back through the border gardens toward the palace, through the lavender and the silver-leaf trees and the wild roses that came back every year without being asked, through the garden her father had planted and she had restored, under the sky where the moon was already rising above the border wall, steady and silver, and completely indifferent to all the things that had been done in its name. Astrid looked up at the moon for a moment. Then she looked at the palace ahead of her, and at the man walking beside her, and at the life that had been built in the 3 months since a wall had been broken open and someone had found her breathing on the other side. She had been declared dead at the border wall. She had been sealed in the dark with nothing but stone and cold, and the ancient warmth of a bond connecting her to someone she hadn't met yet. She had pushed her fear and her hope and her location through a thread her father had told her about on a solstice evening when she was 12 years old, and it had found its other end exactly as he promised. And now she was here, in the garden he had planted, walking toward a life that was genuinely, completely, unreservedly hers. It had started with a sealed wall and a lie spoken over her name. It had ended, or rather, it had begun, with a man who heard her heartbeat through solid stone and decided, without hesitation, that stone was not a thing he was prepared to accept as a barrier. Sometimes the moon goddess needed a little help with the walls. And sometimes that help arrived in the form of an alpha king who had been waiting 11 years to find someone worth breaking through one for. And in doing so, in reaching through everything they had built to stop her, he had freed them both. Thank you so much for listening. If this story moved you, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I read every single one. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribing is free and it means everything.